Hi everybody, welcome to part 2 of our second module. And in this section, we'll be talking about who is visible and invisible in the modern audience. And I want to talk about this in the context of the economic structure of media industries that we described in part 1 of this module. We need to ask ourselves, why do most media exist? And in a sense, the answer to these questions help us understand the goals for media, the audiences for media, and how that shapes what becomes available through the media. On this slide, I have examples of all different kinds of media. The top right that shows me with a Muppet is an example of a not-for-profit media organization, Sesame Workshop. So they have a set of goals that might be quite different from, let's say, MTV and its efforts around introducing music and music celebrities to audiences. And those are quite different. Those goals are quite different from, say, newspapers or magazines. We could list out a variety of reasons why most media exist. They exist to entertain. They exist to inform or educate. They exist to connect people to one another. They exist to create a shared national spirit. And they exist to create a shared identity. So you could probably think of examples and genres in each of these cases. So for example, MTV I think is a very good example of a media property that exists to entertain. Or Sesame Workshop creates Sesame Street, and that exists to educate young children. But other media, for example, social media, exists to connect people to one another. Other media may exist to create this shared national spirit. For example, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds PBS, public broadcasting stations around the country. But we can also think about media that exists to create a shared identity. Social media sites like Twitter or Facebook have in mind not only connecting people to one another, but creating spaces where people who are similar can interact. We call that homophily. So people who have similar characteristics might come together in those kinds of spaces or platforms. But perhaps most importantly is the idea that media exist to make a profit. And this reflects media within a capitalist society, within these large conglomerations that we described in part 1 of this module. And media exists to make a profit and can make a profit in a number of ways. So probably the most important and one of the earliest ways that media generated revenue is selling audiences to advertisers. So for example, if you're watching a television show and you see a product that's advertised, that product is specifically placed within that program because advertisers are looking for a particular kind of demographic. Platforms can also make money, generate revenue by selling subscriptions. So for example, that's how Netflix generates income. We can also think about media organizations that have, let's say, film outlets, movie theaters as another way to make money, selling tickets to audiences or taking that movie, putting it on DVD, selling that to audiences. And more recently, we see a movement toward generating income not through advertising or by selling something like tickets or a product, but by collecting data from audiences and selling those data to other companies that may, for example, want to persuade you one way or another, persuade you to vote a particular way or to persuade you to buy a product. And I'm sure you can think of other ways that media make profit. But this ends up being important for the theme that I want to explore in this part of the model, how it might be problematic. And if we're considering media as making money in particular kinds of ways, selling things to people, generating data for other companies, we also need to be thinking about who gets left out of this structure, out of this equation. So if media are, a big goal of media is to create large enough audiences where the data are shared or they can buy a particular product. Those audiences that are small or unprofitable or hard to measure end up being left out. So, for example, although our country is made up of a plethora of racial and ethnic minority groups, if they're small or if they're low income or if it's difficult to get information from them, then they won't be a part of this larger media landscape. As well, media exist to primarily entertain, educate, and inform, but those who interact with the world differently, for example, children who maybe aren't physically mobile or adults who have language impairments or hearing impairments, they often are not catered to by the media because they are too small or they're too niche, and those companies really aren't interested in serving underserved audiences. As well, we don't understand very much about how media are used by children and adults who live in hard to access places. So we'll talk when we talk about television about the Nielsen ratings and the people meter. But for those who have housing insecurity or instability, they're not going to be measured because they don't have a consistent place to plug in this people meter in order to understand what their media uses and needs are. And again, you can probably think of other audiences that media organizations wouldn't be particularly interested in because they aren't going to produce a lot of revenue for them. So this matters, not just from an academic perspective, but from a, who do we value in our society perspective. If you are invisible as an audience, you are probably invisible in the media. And there are implications for that invisibility. We see, for example, that children who have grown up with television shows that don't have representations of themselves tend to value their own demographic characteristics less because they feel that they aren't valued by the greater population. It also matters for the media economy because there are big swaths of people who aren't integrated into this economy and don't really have much say over the economy. We know that if programs are measuring their success by the size of their audience, if a significant part of that audience isn't measured, then that audience doesn't have an opportunity to sort of vote with their clicker, right, with their remote control, because no one's measuring what they're watching or what they're not watching. It matters as well for the electorate. We know that if people feel disenfranchised from their society, they're going to feel disenfranchised from participating in the democratic process. And that matters as well for the identity of the nation. We also need to think about visibility and invisibility in terms of what we as scholars know about audiences. So I want to show you a study that was produced by a very well-regarded organization, the Pew Center for Research, and highlight to you the challenges that we have in understanding audiences, but also providing a broader public with information about audiences. So this is a 2018 study that caught my eye because I'm interested in youth and media. And they had this headline that said, "Teens say social media helps strengthen friendships, provide emotional support, but can also lead to drama, feeling pressure to post certain types of content. And if we look at this slide, we can see that the authors of this study have listed positive and negative self-reported outcomes of social media use. For example, 81% of the teens in this survey said that they feel more connected to their friends because of social media, but 37% said that they feel pressure to post content that will get a lot of likes and comments. Okay, so that's, these are, we call these top lines. These are descriptions of what's going on. But what we need to ask is, so who are these teens, and are they representative of a broader population? And I'll have you take a look at the note below, right? Respondents who did not give an answer or gave other responses are not shown. The source here is a survey that was conducted in 2018 in March and April. And this survey is called Teens' Social Media Habits and Experiences. So let's dig into what this survey actually entailed. Well, one of the things that they describe is that it's an online survey, and it has two components. There's a parent survey, and they had 1,058 completed interviews. And then they had a teen survey where they had 743 completed interviews. So what is the response rate? The response rate is calculated as the percent of people who participate in the study who were asked to participate in the study. So there's lots of reasons why people will be included or not included in a survey, but it's very important to know the extent to which people who are asked to participate say yes or say no. I've highlighted that for the parents, 8% of those who were asked to be a part of this survey actually responded to the survey, and for the teens, that response rate was only 18%. Now these numbers are quite low. Online surveys are generally low, usually around 20 or 30%, but these are even lower. And it should cause you to say, well, what about the 92% or the 82% who passed? Are these 8% and 18% actually reflective of the broader population, or is there something unusual about them, given how few actually said yes? Another question that we should ask is, who is in this sample? And what is the margin of error? So whenever we're reporting out things like, 50% of potential voters say they're going to vote this way or that way, you always want to know the margin of error, because if it's a big margin of error, like, 10%, then that election could swing on that 10% margin of error. And you'll see as we go over this table that the smaller the sample, the bigger the error. We have in this teen sample 743 teens who are participating in the study, and so generally when they report about the percent who feel that social media is this or that it's about 5 percentage points plus or minus. And we have roughly equal numbers of boys and girls. But then when we get down to the racial and ethnic distribution of this sample, we see that we have more than half of this sample is white. We have 129 Black non-Hispanics, and we have 202 Hispanics. So a couple things about this. Clearly, our the teens who live in our country are more than white, Black, or Hispanic, right? So there are many more racial and ethnic identities. But also important as we look at this is how tiny the Black sample is, and how we're trying to say so much about the teen audience with or at least this part of the teen audience with so few non-white participants. And you'll see that that really shapes the margin of error there. It goes way up from 7% to almost 12% for Blacks and 9.5% for Hispanics. So I highlight these issues for you because as we continue to read studies about the effects of media on different audiences, it's important to think about, well, who's participating in these studies? And as we continue to think about the mainstream media that are generated for broad audiences, we also need to ask ourselves who's missing from these audiences. If you want to read more about I do have a reading for you. It's called The Invisible Children of Media Research. It's a short commentary that I wrote with a PhD student, Kate Prandella. And in it, we talk about the challenges of including children in our research that are difficult to get to, that maybe are living in rural areas, maybe have physical disability, maybe are living and learning outside of school settings. So that's there for you to read if you're interested. As we head into Module 3, I'll have you reading Chapter 2, the Internet, Digital Media, and Media Convergence. And we ask several questions with respect to this. We ask, where did the internet come from? How did it evolve in its present form? We'll look at who controls the internet versus who owns the internet, and a couple of interesting phenomena that have arisen in the last 5 years or so: hashtag activism and the semantic web. So new terms we'll introduce into our vocabulary and take forward with us as we head into the rest of the semester. So I hope you've enjoyed Module 2. Now that you're done, head on over to the quiz and take that real quick and make sure that you get it done by Sunday night. So I hope you're doing well. I hope you're finding the content interesting, and we'll see you for Module 3.